In the student protests in 1989 and the Indian independence movement, both were protesting for major changes in government. The student protests were aiming to change to a democratic system, while the Indian independence movement was aiming for the removal of British rule. The student movement failed terribly with a massacre that scarred the country for years afterward. In contrast, Indian independence was for the most part a rare and lasting example of peaceful protests that worked successfully. What were the variables that led to such vast differences in between these two cases? British rule began in India in 1757 after the British defeated the Bengal rulers. This time became known as the British Raj. After many years of British rule, ideas of Indian independence spread gradually. India's first war of independence was a revolt of Indian soldiers and people against British rule. Even so, the British continued to take regions that belonged to the Indians. The period following India's first war of independence was important to the independence movement as a whole. In December of 1929, the Indian National Congress decided to start a movement for complete independence of British rule. Mahatma Gandhi started this movement when he led 72 people on a 400-kilometer march from Ahmedabad to Dandi. In 1947, Britain handed India its formal political independence. Later on, it was announced the partition of India into two countries, the Union of India and Islamic Pakistan. Early in September 1947, Gandhi referred to the violence following the Declaration of Independence as, quote, "Let it be said of them that the inhabitants of Delhi had gone temporarily mad, but the sanity has now returned." On the other hand, the reason for the 1989 protests were: 1. To affirm Hu Yaobang's views on democracy and freedom. Hu Yaobang was a general secretary who had liberal views amongst officials. 2. Admit that campaigns against spiritual pollution and bourgeois liberalization had been wrong. 3. Publish information on the income of state leaders and their family members. 4. End the ban on privately run newspapers and stop press censorship. 5. Increase funding for education and raise intellectuals' pay. 6. End restrictions on demonstrations in Beijing. And 7. Provide objective coverage for students in official media.
One of the important variables that caused such varied results were the leaders behind each movement. The student protests at China during 1989 were headed by several student leaders, with none of them having a recognized name amongst common people. It was a group of leaders with their own goals and limits. Because there were several leaders, there existed plenty of inner factions within the protest that weakened it unconsciously. All someone has to say is Gandhi, and one is reminded of his peaceful protest against British rule of India. He is undoubtedly the figurehead of the movement. A social movement needs a leader for a variety of reasons. As Aldon Morris and Suzanne Stagenborg said in their study, Leadership in Social Movements, leaders inspire commitment, mobilize resources, create and recognize opportunities, devise strategies, and frame goals. All these lead to influencing the outcome of the movement. What is likely the biggest reason for the difference was the type and status of the government at the time of the protests. During Gandhi's time of protesting, British rule over the area was waning as it was in the midst of turning over the government to the people. The situation was pressuring for years, and violence continued to increase from not only citizens but from Indian soldiers, which was wildly different to the situation in China, where it was generally peaceful student protests. China's government wasn't waning, and generally dealt with situations like this with violent crackdown and then censorship. This situation was different because of the prolonged length of the protests had already attracted international journalists over.